Now, I'd ask my Liberal members to help me make sense of this, because this whole bailout just doesn't make any sense to me. Mark Carney used to take the advice of his banker mentor, Bob Hurst, who said that, quote, if something doesn't make sense, it doesn't make sense. And if it doesn't make sense, he said you should run, because you should never buy simply on trust. But today, the Prime Minister is asking us to accept this bailout on trust, and that doesn't make any sense. In a normal functioning market, excess supply of unsold condos would typically lead to one or both of the following. First, price reductions to clear that supply. So developers would lower their asking price until that price and demand matches supply. That's economics 101, supply and demand. Young Canadians at that point would be able to purchase those condos at the new lower equilibrium price. And as an MP from a generation who has been consistently shut out of the market for the last 10 years, it's insane to me to see a program that would continue to shut out my colleagues and friends in this generation. Now, second, if developers simply refuse to lower their prices, and we know that's what they've told the Prime Minister, because they said they don't want to sell at a loss. The Prime Minister said they're stuck. He wants to help them out. Now, if they don't want to lower their prices, the costs to carry those units remain. And so they might face the losses of that, distressed sales, bankruptcies. So banks or new buyers would acquire those units at discounted prices in distress. And the losses in those cases would be borne by the party that took the risk. But instead, the plan that we have been presented with is to use taxpayer dollars to socialize those losses while developers avoid the full consequences of their actions. So maybe they can help me make sense of that. What also doesn't make sense, Mr. Chair, is this desperate letter that was sent by the Minister of Housing last night, I think at 10:30 or later p.m. last night, to the members of this committee, trying desperately, clearly, to give members of the Liberal Party the cover they need.
Sorry, Mr. Mantle, the letter was actually received this morning.
This morning, okay,
Just so you're aware.
Excellent. So the letter that was received even later to the committee members, which is clearly an attempt by the minister to give the Liberal members cover to avoid this study. But this letter provides no new information, provides no new explanations, and restates some of the unpersuasive arguments that the government has previously made. For example, the minister says that this committee should wait for more details before undertaking a study. Well, I would respond, first of all, that it was the minister and this government that announced this program. Should they not have the information and the details available before they announce a program? And number two, if the minister would like to provide more details, we are requesting him to come to this committee and provide them. Now, second, he says the intent of the program is to purchase at below, quote, market rates. Well, that's a little vague, because we've heard both discussion of costs, purchasing at costs, and purchasing at market. And those are two very different things. So I'd like to know what the cost of those units was and what the market rate the government is proposing to pay for them. And if there's any delta between those two. Again, the minister could come and explain that. And he rehashes and trots out this analogy, which is unfortunately extremely inapt, that when you buy something on liquidation, you don't say to yourself, I'm supporting a bailout for the store. Now, that is an inapt analogy because we're not at liquidation. If we wanted to buy on liquidation, the government would let these go into distress or let the banks and the developers absorb those losses and then buy them at an even reduced price. In fact, what they're doing is preventing the liquidation sale at the cost and expense of the taxpayer and at the cost and the expense of the next generation of homebuyers. And lastly, the minister tries to address our concern and this committee's concern about who was lobbied for this program. And he says, quote, that neither himself nor the Prime Minister were, quote, directly lobbied. That's interesting language, directly lobbied. So were they indirectly lobbied? Were their staff, instead of them, directly lobbied? Maybe we'll see that in disclosures when those are in the future published, and maybe we won't, and that will raise further questions. Now, this study matters because we are in one of the worst times in a generation for young Canadians to buy a home. The average salary no longer buys the average home nearly anywhere in Canada, let alone in places like Vancouver or Toronto. Home prices have outpaced income growth for a decade while this party was in government, and that means that the price-to-income ratio for a home has risen dramatically. And the age of first-time home buyers is higher than it has ever been, about 36 nationally, about 40 in Toronto, and 46 in Vancouver. That has real consequences for families. Family formation is delayed, and people don't even start families because of these concerns with owning a home. And those ages are amongst the highest in the world. And even if you scrape your way into the market, mortgage payments today are eating up a larger and larger share of your income, over 50% of income. We call that being house poor. Now, the missing middle, they did an analysis about 2 years ago, I think it was, showing across the entire OECD that Canada has the worst housing affordability of all the countries in the OECD. And the sad part is that Canada is actually unique because they looked at other countries where affordability has improved or not deteriorated at the same rate as in Canada. So it's simply untrue to claim that Canada's deterioration is the same as everybody else. Actually, Canada's far worse. And this condo bailout changes nothing for those Canadians seeking to enter the market. If anything, it makes it worse by preventing the natural correction in one of the most expensive housing markets in the world. Mr. Chair, let me end by recounting a brief story in the Prime Minister's own words from his own book. When, during his time at the Bank of Canada, he spoke with banks and financiers in the financial crisis who were exposed to their own mess. And he had some thoughts for them, which I think are apt today. So I'm going to read 2 paragraphs from his book on values, and I hope he will remember these values in considering this bailout. He said, and I quote, "When the music stopped, these masters of the universe turned to the state. I remembered that once I became governor of the Bank of Canada in early 2008, I would receive delegations of investors in asset-backed corporate papers or bankers that were exposed to their mess. Their requests had the benefit of being consistently self-interested. They would argue that it was the responsibility of the Bank of Canada to take on their risks. We shouldn't be unduly worried. The market had momentarily taken leave of its senses. They left out the bit about why Canadians who had never had a chance to ask the questions unvoiced by these masters of the financial universe should take on the burden. And they left out the implications such behavior would have for moral hazard in the system. For if banks and markets were bailed out from their mistakes, then what was to stop them from taking on greater risks in the future? A continuation of the heads they win, tails we lose finance. How would that promote the values of responsibility, accountability, prudence, and trust that are essential to sustainable finance? I would ask him the same questions today. Why should Canadians take on this burden? Why should he now continue to allow developers to engage in a heads they win, tails Canadian homebuyers lose housing development plan? How does this condo bailout promote the values of responsibility, accountability, prudence, and trust that are essential to sustainable finance and a sustainable housing market for the next generation? I hope he takes heed of his own values. Thank you, Mr. Chair.